Well, hello and welcome to Sunday Morning Coffee with Dr. Childress. Today I'm going to be discussing the involved mental health professionals around your families, all the various people who are kind of attaching to your family and solving nothing. The I'm using the internet in a kind of an interesting way here. I'm not providing you with like information about um, the topic area. I'm giving you informational, but I'm also providing you with process kind of information about what to do in given the situation you're in. The situation changes, once we get you competent mental health professionals in the family courts, all becomes different. But right now, parents in the family courts don't have any competent mental health professionals around you. And in fact, they're pretty bad mental health professionals. And in fact, they're participating in the child abuse mental health professionals. So that's pretty bad. And I want to begin with a clear understanding that the patient should never, ever, ever have to explain the pathology to the doctor. Unfortunately, in the current state of professional practice, that's the case. The forensic psychologists and the licensing board's failure to enforce ethical standards have just driven the quality of mental health services in the family courts to the bottom. They are the worst imaginable. Again, I would say the mental health people are participating in the child psychological abuse, particularly the individual therapists. They're failing in their duty to protect obligations. That's like malpractice range kind of failure of professional obligations. And they're just ignorant, incompetent, unethical, and lazy. And what happened was in the 1980s, professional psychology tried an experiment, a new approach to service delivery that doesn't diagnose or treat pathology. And it's been an absolute complete failure. And that's what's driven everything down to the bottom in professional standards of practice. And it's just, excuse me, it's just a nightmare over here. So until um, we professional psychology kind of deals with our own problems relative to this and begins to provide professionally competent services for the courts and for these families, you're kind of in a stuck place of having to educate your mental health professionals and navigate this as best you can. Now, in terms of getting competence, you're going to have to go out to clinical psychology and recruit them back to the family courts, but they're not going to want to come, clinical psychologists like me, because we do diagnosis and treatment. And it's too dangerous in the family courts. It's dangerous from the pathology. It's dangerous from minors counsel in the courts. It's not minors, from opposing counsel in the courts. It's dangerous from the forensic psychologists who are on the license boards, and they'll sanction clinical psychologists just because we're here. And so, and clinical psychologists have not been in the family courts for 40 years. And so they don't know the pathology in the family courts. They know delusional thought disorders. They know factitious disorder. Some do. They know attachment pathology, but none of them know how that fits into the narcissistic borderline pathology in the family courts. They can figure it out pretty quick, and I've told them, and I'm the conduit for their return. But right now, they're not competent in the family court pathology. So you really have nobody, either in clinical or forensic psychology, who is competent with the pathology. And that's because you've been neglected by professional psychology. They tried this experiment, it's been an absolute failure. Now everything's going to like crash and burn in the family courts, I suspect, where the family courts are going to have no professional services, competent professional services from psychology. Ultimately, the APA needs to get over here and figure this out, help figure this out, but it's going to be a mess for a while. But what do you do? You've got a family and you're in the middle of a custody fight and post-divorce. What do you do with all these individual therapists and family therapists, reunification therapists? There's no such thing, and all of these people around you. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, kind of orienting you up to what you can do, and but a little bit of education to start with about professional psychology and healthcare and doctors and stuff, and then we'll step into what you can do about the current situation. So, starting with, um, in all of healthcare, diagnosis guides treatment, and the treatment for cancer is different than the treatment for diabetes. I'm surprised I have to explain that to people, but I guess I do. The diagnosis guides treatment. Treatment for cancer is different. So we need to get a diagnosis. Are we treating cancer or diabetes? The differential diagnosis is child abuse by one parent or the other. So is it are we treating child abuse by the targeted parent, in which case we diagnose it and develop a treatment plan for that? Or are we treating psychological child abuse by the allied pathological parent, in which case we diagnose that and develop a treatment for that? But they're two different treatments. And so we kind of need what the diagnosis is, one way or the other. And it's always going to be a child abuse diagnosis when you have severe attachment pathology. Either it's authentic and it's true, and then we have child abuse by the targeted parent, or it's a false allegation of child abuse and we got psychological child abuse by the allied parent. So as soon as we get up to severe attachment pathology and concerns about child abuse, we're going to be returning a child abuse diagnosis. And so that's where, like, that should be happening all the time. If you don't have a child abuse diagnosis coming out of the family courts here, then you're misdiagnosing child abuse because that's the only cause of this level of pathology. But that's a fundamental issue. Now, one of the features, because of the misleading and ignorance of forensic psychologists, is everybody thinks this is a custody issue. No, it's not. It's a treatment issue. It's a pathology issue. Custody is easy peasy. That's like you either roughly 50-50, or you give one parent every other weekend and the other parent's school week, or you go for a vacation schedule, distance schedule of primary school year to one parent and then the vacation time to the other, kind of thing. But there's really only like three patterns of custody. And courts can make those decisions based on geographic issues or issues that the court considers. They can do that just fine. The problem is we have this pathology. The child's rejecting a parent, and that raises concerns. Is that an abusive parent, or is the other parent abusive, one way or the other? And so we need a diagnosis on that. And that's what the court requires or would benefit from, is a diagnosis out of the doctors about whether or not which parent is abusing the child, and what to do about it. But the forensic psychologists aren't giving that to the court. They don't diagnose pathology, then, which is crazy to me, malpractice to me. But and so because the forensic psychologists have failed, you're kind of in a stuck place. But you do have mental health people around you who should be diagnosing the pathology, each one. So as we talk about the mental health people around you, this is something important to understand. You because you're thinking you need to go into the court and get an assessment, or an order for an assessment and a diagnosis. No, actually you don't, because any involved mental health professional should be doing that, and we'll talk about that in a second. So yes, we can go into the courts. Yes, we can get orders for a proper assessment, risk assessment, and stuff, and that in many cases that'll be necessary. But that's only because the currently involved people, are failing to diagnose the pathology, and they all should be diagnosing the pathology. If you're treating something, are you treating cancer or diabetes? And we'll find out about that in a second. But to start with, let's just talk about some of the terms here. So diagnosis means the same thing as identify. Pathology means the same thing as problem, and treatment means the same thing as fix it. So in my writings right now on the Facebook, you'll see sometimes I'll be shifting terms around. I'll discuss about the pathological parent, and they'll put parentheses and call them the problematic parent, because you can use the same terms, just whether or not you want to be more informal versus more structured and professional on this. But we must first identify what the pathology is. And so these two sentences mean the same thing. We must first diagnose what the pathology is before we know how to treat it. We must first identify what the problem is before we know how to fix it. And so when the other parent is trying to drive this into the courts to make it about custody and put you on trial for being a bad parent, get the kids to testify against you and all sorts of difficult, bizarre stuff, you want to move it back out to treatment. You say, wait a minute, Your Honor, before we decide on custody here, let's first identify what the problem is in the family, and let's get a plan out of the mental health people on how to fix it. Because, now here's the thing. The allied parent is making an abuse allegation against the targeted parent, at least by the child's symptoms. If child's rejecting a parent, that implies that parent is abusive. So we have abusive range concerns just simply off the child's symptoms, and then the allied parent kind of supports that and comes up with their own allegations of maltreatment by the targeted parent, because it's their persecutory delusion that's being spread to the child. But now the targeted parent is also making an equal allegation of psychological abuse by the allied parent, that they are creating this persecutory delusion, a psychotic disorder, a persecutory thought disorder in the child, and a false, factitious attachment pathology in order to meet their own needs and manipulate the court. So we have both sides of this situation making abuse allegations against the other. So we need to get a proper risk assessment for possible child abuse. In all cases of family court custody conflict where there's severe attachment pathology, we need to get a proper risk assessment for possible child abuse. And holy cow, that's not happening. So that's a real problem for us as doctors. Now, a number of times when you go out and start asking for the mental health people for their diagnosis, you currently involved people, and you will, and we need to identify what, or at least identify what they identify the problem as. What do you think the problem is? Therapist, what's your diagnosis? They're going to tell you, many of them will tell you, I don't diagnose pathology and stuff, which is insane. So they're telling you basically, I don't decide whether it's cancer or diabetes. I just prescribe the treatment. That's just insane from a healthcare perspective. And I was taught as a trainee to always put your diagnosis on formal paperwork, and that's what I train my postdocs and trainees to. Always put your diagnosis on formal paperwork, because if you don't, then you are asserting for a fact that you have verified that there is no diagnosable pathology in the family. Because if there was, you diagnose it, right? If there was schizophrenia, you diagnose schizophrenia and tell the court and that one parent has schizophrenia, right? If there was child abuse in the family, which is a DSM diagnosis, if there was child abuse, you would diagnose that, right? You'd identify that there was child abuse and you'd tell the court that one of the parents was, wouldn't you? And the everyone could say, well, of course, I identify or child abuse, or identify schizophrenia or something with the parent. Well, then what's your diagnosis here? Is there child abuse? Oh, well, I didn't put, well, then you're asserting there is no child abuse in the family, because otherwise we would see that, right? And because we're not seeing that, even by a rule out. Now, rule outs on a diagnosis mean it's a possibility. So you could say I'm ruling out possible child abuse in this situation. Okay, that's a possible, but you're not even putting that down as a possibility here, that there's even a possibility of child abuse if you don't put down a diagnosis. So that's just negligent malpractice, to not identify what the problem is before you start treating it. What are you treating? Cancer or diabetes? So they're in a lot of problems, and they'll get into a lot of problems on cross examination. I'll talk about that later with the family law attorneys if they don't put a diagnosis. And no custody evaluation has a diagnosis, so they do 6 to 9 months for $20,000 to $40,000 on a custody evaluation, and we still need another assessment to get a diagnosis. It's just financial exploitation and just a nightmare. But here's the thing, all mental health professionals, all doctors, all healthcare professions have duty to protect obligations. And we have two duties, legally obligating duties, duty of care and duty to protect. And so there's three types of dangerous pathology, and that's a category of pathologies in clinical psychology. They're called dangerousness. There's three of them: suicide, homicide, and abuse, child abuse, spousal abuse, and elder abuse. And whenever a mental health professional encounters one of these abuse diagnoses or one of these dangerous pathologies, we are required to do a proper risk assessment or make sure that one gets conducted. So you just think like with suicide. If a patient is suicidal or expresses suicidal ideation, we're required to conduct a proper risk assessment for the suicide, past history, previous attempts, current means, all these sorts of things we're trained in to conduct a proper suicide risk assessment for a suicidal patient, or we have to get them into an ER or something, get them over to somebody who can do a proper risk assessment for suicide or for homicide or for spousal abuse or for child abuse or for any of the dangerous pathologies. It activates our duty to protect obligations, and we have to make sure something gets done about that. And they're not. In all cases of severe attachment pathology, the only cause is child abuse. So for severe, anything less than child abuse produces a different type of stuff. It produces what's called an insecure attachment that has different types of symptoms. It doesn't produce a child rejecting a parent. If you have a child rejecting a parent, the differential diagnosis is child abuse by the targeted parent, in which case you diagnose that, put it on a treatment plan, or child psychological abuse, shared persecutory delusion, factitious disorder, from the allied parent, in which case you diagnose that and put it on a treatment plan. But either way, it's going to be child abuse. So in all cases of this severe attachment pathology, a child rejecting a parent, we should be getting a proper risk assessment for possible child abuse. So that's where you don't actually need to get the court to order anything or do anything. You don't need every single mental health professional involved in your matter should be making sure that we get a proper risk assessment for possible child abuse. They should be taking the initiative. If they can't do it themselves, then they should be recommending it get done and be guiding the process into that. Now, when I get dropped into the rabbit hole over here in the family courts, you look at my vita. I'm not from the family courts. I'm a clinical psychologist. I don't work in the family courts, for my entire career until I kind of started to retire and got a little curious as to what's happening here. And when I encountered, because I'm a trauma psychologist out of foster care, when I encountered the dangerous pathologies of child abuse and spousal abuse, both active in the family courts, my duty to protect obligations were active. And typically, I would refer you families to your mental health people to get the proper assessment. Unfortunately, I can't do that because the mental health people around you are ignorant, incompetent, and colluding, participating in the child abuse. So your mental health people, particularly the individual therapists for the children, but also the family therapists, are participating in the child abuse and failing in their duty to protect obligations. So there you have nobody I can refer you to. Oh my goodness, it's so bad over here. So that's where I've been doing 10 years of educating you parents on your rights and what the pathology is so that you are empowered to be able to protect your child, hopefully, but you have to educate your mental health people, and then there you got a bunch of people who are directing you into parental alienation and all sorts of destructive stuff. And so, yeah, it's been a challenge to get parents to stop using parental alienation and to become informed consumers, but also to get the mental health people to do what they're supposed to be doing, and they're just absolutely refusing. Um, so let's talk about the categories around you just for a second, just to orient you to all the menagerie of mental health people you have. You have psychiatrists; those are the MD doctors. Typically, psychiatrists prescribe medication. You might encounter them for an ADHD diagnosis or something like that. But in the family courts, you might find some forensic psychiatrists and stuff. But typically, they don't do psychotherapy, and typically, they're medication support. Then you have the psychologists, and those in the family courts are the forensic psychologist, your experimental new psychologist, or everybody else would be called clinical psychologists, where the clinical is the diagnosis and treatment psychologist, forensic psychologists are the custody evaluation psychologists. And there's two categories. PhD is a blend of some treatment and some research. It sets up for professorships at university, teaching positions at universities, but also therapy. So they're kind of hybrid between teaching and research and therapy. The PsyD degree gives up the training in the research side, so they are entirely treatment. So they're going to be a little bit more advanced on the treatment side, but you won't find them in the university teaching settings. Then you drop down to the master's level people. So the psychologists, in sort of a military analogy, would be your captains and above. So they're your officer corps, and they should know the pathology. And as the psychologists lead, the master's level and these under levels will follow. So right now, it's a failure in professional psychology. The APA, American Psychological Association, and the doctors are failing, the courts failing the parents and failing the children. And if the doctors were to step up and start accurately diagnosing, that would provide the structural support for the rest, um, to solve this pathology. The master's level and the licensed professional counselors are all sort of treatment providers. Those are your non-commissioned officers, your sergeants kind of down. They're your folks that are actually out in the field providing a lot of the treatment because they're less expensive than the doctors are. So then we have the first category is the marriage and family therapists, MFTs. They have 2 years of training, and they should know family therapy. I'm not sure why they don't, but those are pretty much frontline therapists for most things, and you'll run into those a lot as your child therapists. And I want to say again, the child therapists are the most vulnerable, and I would say almost 100% of the time in this family court pathology, they are participating in creating the delusional thought disorder. So they are active participants in the child abuse because they don't understand the pathology and they think they're just there for a specific role without they're misdiagnosing the pathology. So, and they're failing in their duty to protect, and they're creating the false belief because they believe it. They're validating the child's feelings. You don't validate a delusional thought disorder, but they're misdiagnosing. So, I would say all the individual therapists in the family courts should lose their license for participating in child abuse. A mental health professional should never, ever, ever be the child abuser, but they all are. So if you have an individual child therapist involved in your matter, you can pretty much count on they're likely being participants in the child abuse. So you're going to have to overcome them or get them off the case. We don't need individual therapists for most of your kids out there. Most of your kids are fine. They're not having a problem. It's the family around them that's a problem. If we can solve the family around your children are going to be okay. They don't need therapy. So we need a family therapist, just one. And boy, you get so many professionals on your cases, all these different therapists, family therapists. Each child has an individual therapist. You have an individual therapist. Other parent has, no, they don't. But there's just, and then there's GALs and parenting coordinators and other people. And you don't need any of those other people either. You don't need a guardian ad litem. You don't need a parenting coordinator. You don't need minors counsel. Definitely don't need a minors counsel. That would be appointing an attorney to represent the pathology. And the moment you get an attorney representing the pathology, they're going to lock it in and it's not going to change. So they're kind of a problem. The legal system needs to look at the role of minors counsel in the family courts because they're representing child abuse and trying to get the court to continue the child abuse, which is kind of a problematic position for an officer of the court. But so we got marriage and family counselors. And then you reach the next level of licensed people. Now, licensed mean that you're authorized by the state to diagnose and treat. So if they're telling you, I don't diagnose, that's licensed. You're licensed, meaning you're authorized to give a diagnosis. Now, the next level down is the social workers, MSWs, licensed clinical social workers, LCSW. And these are the lowest level of training in mental health services. You think about it, social workers are trained in getting families food stamps and social services getting, and they are trained in some therapy, but mostly it's for, severe kind of stuff. Like they're working with schizophrenia. And so they're doing the social work around schizophrenia, maybe doing some family work around that, or, various things like that, where they're in low income families are getting social services, but also maybe doing some therapy with the family that's in a difficult position. They're not qualified for delusional thought disorders. They're not qualified for the level of pathology in this situation. I've worked with some fantastic social workers, particularly in schizophrenia, but elsewhere. I've worked with some fantastic MFTs. But we really need to get the competence in these folks, and they're not trained by their education in that. So, yeah, the social workers are probably should be moving out of the family court system. I don't see that they're necessary. We should be moving to a different caliber of professional. Then the licensed professional counselors are to your low level or low pay level therapists for typically for children. That they don't have a master's degree, but they're trained in some sort of therapy type stuff, play therapy, oftentimes, and they're low cost, and so that you get school referrals out to the licensed professional counselor, LPC. Um, and they are way over their head with a delusional thought disorder and factitious disorder. Their background education and training is not anywhere near what's needed for this pathology. And so we just have competence issues the moment you drop below the doctor's level on this. And you have incompetent doctors at this point in the family courts. So that's good luck. So diagnosis guides treatment. What you're going to want as a parent is you're going to want a written treatment plan to fix the problem in your family, to a written treatment plan to fix the pathology in your family, which is a shared delusional disorder and child psychological abuse. That's the diagnosis that's going to be guiding treatment one way or the other is child abuse. And we need to protect the child. The question is from which parent. So you're gonna want to get a written treatment plan. And that's absolutely dead on common. In clinical psychology, you will not get one in forensic psychology. None of these reunification therapists, there's no such thing, will give you one. Individual therapists are not likely to give you, in the family courts, are not likely to give you a treatment plan. They will outside for ADHD or autism or eating disorder. Absolutely, the individual therapists will give you the diagnosis and treatment plan because they're clinical psychologist people, not forensic. The forensic people are the worst ever. So, just to orient you to what a treatment plan should have, it should have goals and they should be specified in measurable terms because you're going to be measuring them with your outcome measure. So, you should have a set of goals There should be an interventions identified for each goal, should have specified interventions. There should be estimated timeframes for accomplishing those goals or for benchmarks along the path to reaching those goals. And we should have outcome measures to monitor treatment progress and measure when we've reached our goals. And this is so common. You can Google it, and I would suggest you do. Google mental health treatment plans, read the top two returns, whatever they are, because I'm confident they're going to explain this to you, because that's how common it is. Or WikiHow. You can go to WikiHow and Google mental health treatment plans, and it'll come up with like a whole list of 13 things that should be on a written treatment plan. And notice that when you Google this, it includes a signature. So if you're not like signing off on the diagnosis and treatment plan, then that's a problem, because everywhere else in healthcare, that's standard of practice, and you're just like getting nothing. And the problem is they will refuse. Your current crop of mental health professionals won't give you a treatment plan because they don't have one, and they won't tell you the diagnosis because they've misdiagnosed it. And so they'll put up all sorts of barriers to you getting the information that you need. Um, so this is from this white paper, "Improving Diagnosis in Healthcare," by the American Academy of Sciences or something. You can Google it, "Improving Diagnosis in Healthcare," and this paper will show up. And one of the way that they talk about diagnosis here, I think, is useful to orient to it. Is we start with a working diagnosis, and then somebody comes in. If I have a postdoc or pre-doc intern we expect them to return their initial diagnosis after the first 90-minute interview. So they do a 90-minute intake with a family, and they give us their diagnosis. Um, so after 90 minutes, we should have a diagnosis. Now, there might be provisional because we still need some more information, or there might be a couple of rule outs because we're not quite sure which direction it goes after that 90-minute intake session. But we should have our diagnosis in place and where we're going with stuff. And then we have about 6 weeks, typically, is considered standard practice, where we can formalize in our diagnosis. And during that 6-week period, we have our working diagnosis. And it may be either a list of possible diagnoses, which is differential diagnosis. It could be schizophrenia, or it could be bipolar disorder with psychotic features, or it could be child abuse by the targeted parent, or it could be child abuse by the allied parent. And so we have a list of differential diagnoses here. It could be a possible delusional disorder. It could be, emotional abuse by the targeted parent. It could be a number of different things we put on the list of differential diagnoses. Or it could be a single diagnosis. If a person comes in, it's pretty clear they have schizophrenia. They're hallucinating and delusional and bizarre behavior. And so our working diagnosis is schizophrenia off the first intake. And then we confirm that within the next 6 weeks. Typically, clinicians will consider more than one diagnostic hypothesis or possibility as an explanation of the patient's symptoms. Yes, we do. That's differential diagnosis. We put everything on the table, and then we systematically collect information in our clinical interviews to rule some in and some out. And so we're active in our clinical interviews, not like the forensic psychologist. Forensic psychologists sit back and let you talk. That's bizarre. No, clinical psychologists, we have all these diagnoses that are in the back of our minds, possibilities, and we're asking you specific information to rule some in and some out. It could be autism, or we're talking about high functioning autism, or possibly low functioning ADHD. Well, what are the symptoms that would differentiate between the two? And then we go find out about those symptoms. Diagnosis is a pattern match of the symptoms to the diagnostic criteria. Just like the court applies statutes, the law to the evidence, we do the same thing as doctors. We get our evidence, which is the symptoms, and then we apply the diagnostic criteria to the symptoms. If there's a pattern match of symptoms to diagnose, then that's your diagnosis, whether you like it or not. So if you're pattern matching to schizophrenia, That's your diagnosis, schizophrenia. And you say, I don't have schizophrenia. No, there's really, this bizarre stuff going on. The devil's talking to me. No, you do have schizophrenia because you're pattern matched to the diagnostic criteria. A lot of these ignorant, incompetent mental health people are claiming the diagnosis is PTSD, post traumatic stress disorder, that the targeted parents somehow traumatized the child and that the child continues to have these post traumatic fears and stuff. Criterion A for a PTSD diagnosis is exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. That's the first criteria. It defines what a trauma is that produces post traumatic symptoms. It has to do neurologically and thing. So, was the child exposed to death, serious injury, or sexual violence by the targeted parent? If the answer is no, then there is no PTSD diagnosis. It doesn't pattern match to the PTSD diagnosis, so they've misdiagnosed the pathology. So if you run into a PTSD explanation for your child's symptoms and your child hasn't been exposed to death, serious injury, or sexual violence by you, then that's a misdiagnosis right off the top. And they didn't bother to check the diagnostic criteria, the DSM. They were just making stuff up from their own fantasies and illusions. So we start with the working diagnosis. Then, as the diagnostic process, and notice it's a process, proceeds, a fairly broad list of possible diagnoses will be narrowed down to a few potential ones. And then that process is referred to as diagnostic modification or refinement. And then we go into diagnostic verification and we ask a few questions and about the possibilities, and that will help us identify what's there. We can also do something called response to intervention that will be brought up in a second. But there's a process by which we it's like 20 questions. That's the way I teach students. I've taught classes and diagnoses and stuff. And the way I teach students is like 20 questions. You start, is it a mammal? Is it a fish? Oh, it's a fish. Is it a freshwater fish or saltwater fish? And we keep asking the questions and narrowing down all the possibilities until we get, is it a salmon? Yay. Okay. So the next feature about diagnosis is the response to intervention. That sometimes we can be a little unclear, about the diagnosis. The typical example is with schizophrenia, with depression, versus bipolar disorder with psychotic features. In one case, schizophrenia, that's a psychotic disorder, and there's mixed depression in that, we would treat with an antipsychotic medication. In the other case, bipolar disorder, that's a mood disorder, but it's got psychotic features. We would treat with a mood stabilizer. But both of them have psychotic features and mood, depression. So which is it? Psychiatrists can sometimes get in a difficult question about that. And that's where a lot of times the psychiatrists will do what's called a response to intervention. They'll take their best guess. They'll say, I think it's schizophrenia here. They'll treat with the antipsychotic medication. If it works, then yay, that was the correct diagnosis. If it doesn't work, if the pathology does not respond to the treatment, then it's like it's a misdiagnosis, and you go over to the other possibility. There's only two possible explanations for a failed treatment, for the pathology not responding to treatment. Either one, it's a misdiagnosis and you're treating cancer with insulin, or two, you're not competent in the delivery of the intervention for that diagnosis. Because if you accurately diagnose the pathology and you're competent in the delivery of the intervention for that pathology, then you're going to fix the pathology. It's going to be fixed. And so if you're not fixing it, if you're not seeing changes in the pathology, then you look either at your diagnosis or your competence. And a lot of times you look at the diagnosis, you've misdiagnosed the pathology, or there's something else going on that's called a barrier to treatment, that also needs to be identified, also needs to be diagnosed. So, in addition, the provision of treatment can also inform and refine the working diagnosis, which is indicated by the feedback loop from treatment into the information gathering step of the diagnostic process. So, this gives you your best chance with the current mental health professionals to begin shaping their initial diagnosis or ideas, identification of what they thought the problem was, but as they get more experience with the child and with the pathological parent, you can begin to help them bring that treatment related information to update their diagnosis. And so that's probably the best way to work with them, is to get them to kind of update their diagnosis based on the additional information. And you providing them with like maybe these quotes to help them train them in how to do diagnosis. That's insane that the patient is helping the doctor develop the ability to diagnose pathology. And so, hey, look, you got differential diagnoses and you can use treatment. And insane that doctors don't know how to do this. But this also illustrates the needs for clinicians to diagnose health problems that may arise in treatment. So that's your best approach for the current treatment providers, if you can get that, is to get them to update their diagnosis. The issue is child abuse, and we need that diagnosis out of the mental health professionals to be able to act with the clarity to protect the child. No treatment's going to work as long as I'm sending the kid home to be beaten with electrical cords or to be sexually abused by the stepdad. No treatment is going to work until I first, for child abuse, until I first protect the child. So, and this is going to be a child abuse diagnosis one way or the other. I just need to identify which parent am I going to protect the child from. And that's critical for all mental health people, because if you're and this is to the judges, if you're leaving the child in a shared custody situation where one of the parents is abusing the child, then child abuse is going on, and no treatment's going to be effective. So pretty much in all these high conflict custody cases where the child's rejecting a parent, it should be a diagnosis one way or the other. And if you're not getting that diagnosis and not protecting the child, then you're participating in the child abuse because you're not protecting the child. So um, the consultation is another way of improving diagnosis. So we use in clinical psychology all the time, all over healthcare, all the time. You go into your physician, you say, "Oh, this kind of hurts." They say, "Let's get an orthopedic consult." Right away, boom, you're out to another consult. They may ask for a third consult from another. Doctors consult all the time because our diagnosis must be accurate 100% of the time. If we misdiagnose a pathology, our treatment's not going to work and the patient's going to die. I was trained at Children's Hospital. If you don't accurately diagnose the cancer, the patient dead. And so, no, doctors have an obligation to accurately diagnose the pathology 100% of the time, especially on child abuse. Holy Toledo. If we misdiagnose child abuse, that child's life is ruined. And so if you don't want that pressure of being accurate 100% of the time, go do something else, because the healthcare field is not for you. You're not a doctor level person if you're not willing to step up and make sure your diagnosis is accurate 100% of the time, which is why I know so much stuff, because my diagnosis has to be accurate 100% of the time. The child's relying on that. So consultation is one of the ways that doctors deal with that. If I have a question, I go to somebody else, I talk it over and get some additional input from their expertise, from their specializations. So clinicians may refer or consult with other clinicians, formally or informally, to seek additional expertise about a patient's healthcare problem. The consult may help to confirm or reject the working diagnosis, or may provide information on potential treatment options. So that should be happening a lot in the family courts, because this is going to be a disputed diagnosis. I guarantee that one side or the other is going to dispute the diagnosis. And so rather than that, we need to bring the fighting to a close. So let's get that consultation right up front so that we get the court an accurate information supported by a second opinion or even a third opinion if necessary, whatever we need to do to make sure we get an accurate diagnosis that the court can rely on, because we're looking at child abuse and the court may likely need to take a child protection response. And so we need to ensure that we're giving the court accurate information, because if we misdiagnose it, the child's going to go to the abusive parent and we will have destroyed that child's life. So, yeah, consultation is a good thing all the time, everywhere. And this is my professional website, my consulting website. It's got old trees on it right now. That it has this background, this tree background, my consulting website. And Dr. C.A. Childress Consulting. And particularly, you'll want to notice the mental health professionals page. There's a mental health consultation page. Patients should never have to explain the pathology to the doctor. So what I'm doing on the mental health page is I'm giving the doctors the explanation of the pathology. So you can just refer them to Dr. Childress's mental health page, and I will explain the pathology to them. They may not listen, they may not like me, they may disagree with me a lot of stuff, but I will take responsibility. Doctors should be explaining pathology to the doctors, not the patients. But you do, so I've given you also additional resources for you to do that, for you to explain the pathology to the doctors. For example, there's a handout over on the attorney resource section about this description of the pathology. So you can give that to various people and say this, the Dr. Childress explains the pathology in this handout, or in my book Foundations, various other booklets. But also the attorney resource section has a handout on risk assessments, and some other handouts, telehealth consultation, that you may find useful. So that's that. So what do you do about your mental health people in the family courts? Well, the first thing you're going to want to do is challenge their diagnosis. It's a misdiagnosis. Have they diagnosed the other allied parent as psychologically abusing the child when they are psychologically abusing the child, creating a shared delusion and factitious pathology? If they haven't, then they've misdiagnosed the problem, misidentified the problem. So you're going to challenge that. You're going to say, I think you've misdiagnosed the pathology. So if you went into a physician, and you can always use this analogy of going back to medicine because we're doctors. So if you go into a physician and they say you have cancer, and you don't believe it, you don't trust them, what do? You go get a second opinion on their diagnosis. You challenge it as a potential misdiagnosis. And that's what you're going to want to do in this situation. You're going to want to challenge their diagnosis as misdiagnosed. And that happens. That's no problem. You challenge my diagnosis. I present the symptom evidence that I said the pattern matched, and see, a pattern matched to symptoms, and I support my diagnosis. If they can't support their diagnosis, then guess what? It's a misdiagnosis. And that's what's happened here. And if you diagnose cancer as diabetes, your patient's going to die from the misdiagnosed cancer. So it's totally within your rights and obligations with your child. If you think there's been a misdiagnosis, challenge it. Now, in order to challenge it, you first have to find out what their diagnosis and treatment plan is. But they won't tell you because they've misdiagnosed it and they're covering up and a bunch of stuff. And that's bizarre. Again, imagine you going into your doctor, your physician, and saying, what's my diagnosis? And the physician says, I'm not going to tell you, but here's some pills. No, they tell you your diagnosis. They take time, they explain it to you, they explain the different treatment options, and they work out what to do about the diagnosis. That should be happening in the family courts with your mental health professionals, but we're far from that. So they're going to hide, they're going to cover up, and say, I don't diagnose, or I can't release it, you're going to have to become familiar with the release of information laws in your area. Yes, they must release information if you're authorized, and there's various things that they can't cover up. There's no such thing as secret therapies. And you're a parent. This is your child, and especially if you're participating in the therapy as some sort of reunification therapy or family therapy, then you should be explained the diagnosis and treatment plan. If they said you abused your child when you didn't, and that's the reason the child's rejecting you, is some past, and well, challenge the misdiagnosis. Tell me what it is. PTSD from, well, the criteria A doesn't fit. So it can't be PTSD. So you misdiagnosed it right off the top. And I'm going to be suggesting it's child psychological abuse, a shared delusion. Have you assessed for a shared delusion? What's missing? Why would this not be a shared persecutory delusion? Why wouldn't this be child psychological abuse? What would be missing? What would be required for this to become child psychological abuse or spousal abuse, psychological abuse using the child? What would have to happen for this to rise to the level of spousal abuse, psychological abuse of me using the child as a weapon? And so you want to begin to challenge that diagnosis. It's a simple pattern match, and they should be able to support it. When they refuse, if they refuse, when they refuse to provide you with information about your child's diagnosis and treatment, you want to document that. And that's letter to a stranger. You can Google that, Wright's Law. You want to document that because from that point, when you're documenting your mental health people into the situation, you're not actually emailing them or talking to them. You're documenting them into the record for the magistrate who's going to hear the case. So this letter to a stranger is out of advocacy in ADHD and autism in the schools, but it's adaptable over to the family courts. It's just a simple procedure where you document them into the record, the situation. The So when you're doing that, when you're interacting with your mental health people, oh, and let me be, yeah, you want to request a treatment progress update. The mental health people, psychologists, mental health people write reports at three different times. So we write it at, we can write a report at intake assessment report, discharge, a discharge summary, or when anybody asks. And when anybody asks, that's a treatment progress update. Typically, we describe, you know, the basic context, how often we've seen them, since when, and we kind of orient to what we've done so far, and then we give the background of symptoms and family stuff. Then we typically, hopefully, provide our diagnosis for the situation, then our treatment plan, and how that treatment plan is going. Is it progressing? Is it not progressing? That sort of thing. And so that we do that all the time. So you request that because if you want to get a documentation on their diagnosis and treatment plan. Now, when you do that, though, you will, in your caliber of mental health people out there, you will potentially introduce what's called a narcissistic injury because you will be exposing their inadequacy. They didn't do that. They don't know what they're doing. And when you start questioning them, you're going to be exposing that they don't know what they're doing. And they're going to get very scared about possible sanctions and difficult situations, and they're going to retaliate against you. That's a very strong possibility with your caliber of mental health people. Now, that should never, ever, ever, ever happen, that the mental health professional retaliates against a parent who's seeking information about their diagnosis. But that'll happen in the family courts. I have reports from parents, and I've seen the retaliation. So that's why I recommend that you be kind. When you're asserting stuff, as we assert, like I am right now, we're in a background state of angry. This is power assertion and voice. It's not angry, but it's power assertion and voice. And so it's coming off of that emotional channel. And what you want to do instead is smile. You want to get over into the happy channel because that's your social bonding channel. And you can say the same thing. So why doesn't this meet criteria for possible child abuse? Notice I'm keeping a little happy smile on, and it changes my voice, and I'm not so assertive. Because if we assert, you're going to get pushback and people are going to retaliate and stuff. But if you stay in a kind place, they can't label you as being a harsh parent, or that you're argumentative and you're an angry parent, and all the ways they'll try to retaliate against you. But if you stay kind, then you don't give them that ammunition. And then be careful. Don't assume that your mental health people that are currently in the family courts and around you are safe. Don't assume that they are knowledgeable, until they show that they are knowledgeable, until they show that they are can be trusted and being competent. So be careful out there. Then going back to the where we started, diagnosis guides treatment. And the differential diagnosis for severe attachment pathology, a child rejecting a parent surrounding divorce, is child abuse by one parent or the other. That's the only thing that causes a child to reject a parent. That's severe attachment pathology. The only question is which parent. And that's what we need an accurate diagnosis on. So, because this is a factitious, a false attachment pathology, that's an interesting type category. It's not like autism. Autism's the child with autism isn't trying to hide or fake that they have autism. The child with an eating disorder, is 90 big pounds or something, 80 pounds. They're not faking the eating disorder. In this pathology, though, it is a false. And so the mental health people can be misled, easily manipulated by the Machiavellian manipulation of the dark parent. And so it's easy for the mental health people who are not competent and not aware to be misled. But if you can begin to introduce that concept that this is a false, factitious attachment pathology being imposed on the child, and that it's a persecutory delusion, it's a persecutory thought disorder. And give them the definition of persecutory thought disorder from American Psychiatric Association. Say, why does this not meet that criteria? That the person or someone to whom the person is close, the child, is being malevolently treated in some way. They're not. I'm the normal range. They're not being malevolently treated in some way, but they believe they are. Why wouldn't that not meet the criteria for persecutory delusion? It does. So they're just misdiagnosing it. But if you can get them to recognize that it's a factitious disorder, it's a false pathology, and that child psychological abuse is on the table now relative to the other parent, then they do need to protect obligations, become active, and we need to get them to stand up and protect the child. Make that child abuse diagnosis and protect the child. Inform the court that there's child abuse there. Put it in your report, your treatment progress report, so that the court and the healthy targeted parent can take the necessary steps to protect the child and restore normal and healthy functioning to the family. Because if we're treating cancer with insulin, the patient is going to die from the misdiagnosed cancer. Diagnosis guides treatment. We need an accurate diagnosis, and the accurate diagnosis is child abuse, one parent or the other. The only question is which parent. So we need to get that proper risk assessment. We need to orient the mental health people to their obligations and responsibilities. And if they are tentative or hesitant about that, because they're out there all by themselves. And once they make the diagnosis of child psychological abuse, the pathological parent says, how dare you say this wonderful relationship is abusive? You're incompetent. And they're going to file malpractice, or not malpractice, they're going to file a board complaint against the involved mental health professional for making diagnosis of child abuse towards them. So for that mental health professional, because it's dangerous to practice in the family courts, and that's why they don't come, that mental health professional can get extra support by consultation. And so they consult, they document that in the chart. And if you've consulted on your diagnosis and stuff, you're safe from retaliation. The licensing boards and clinical psychology look favorably on consultation. If you have any questions, go out, talk with somebody. And if it's a mistake, it's a mistake, but you did the proper things of consulting. And so, that we should have a lot more consulting in the family courts. Once I'm out of here, people look, old guy. Once I'm out of here, and people continue to evolve into the solutions, I would recommend you get consultation groups in the family courts where you just the people who work in the family courts, the specialists, clinical psychologists who will ultimately be here, it should be part of consultation groups where they can or have consultants that they can do. And we should always get a two-person diagnosis on that initial diagnosis, a second opinion on it right up front, even a third opinion. This is litigation, so you have the mental health person doing the assessment, and then two consultants, one for each party on the situation. Get a three-doctor report, goes into the court, and then the court can decide on what to do relative to its decisions on child custody and possible child protection. So, with that, that's my Sunday talk to you, parents. Good luck out there. Be careful. Your mental health people are not safe, and they are ignorant like a rock. Um, the question becomes, where are the licensing boards? Why are we having standards this low in the family courts? Where's the American Psychological Association? Why is the American Psychological Association giving the family courts this absolutely low quality of mental health services? Why aren't they over here improving the quality of mental health services that they deliver in the court system and to these children and families? Why do they give them this experiment for 40 years that has destroyed thousands of lives of children and their parents for decades, because of the ignorance, incompetence, and the experiment that they conducted on you parents? So, with that, I'm going to head off to my Sunday, and we'll talk next Sunday. Take care, everybody.